Hello, we're getting ready to start this panel. It's great to see everybody still here this afternoon. My name is Jean Athey, and I have the great pleasure, of welcoming, louder, okay, can you hear me? Okay, all right. My name is Jean Athey, and I have the great pleasure and honor of introducing this panel, which is entitled Financial Trade-Offs, Budgets, and Conversion, or also known as Follow the Money. So we're supposed to have 4 people on the panel. 2 of them I haven't seen, and so we have 2 really fabulous speakers, and if the other 2 come in, I'm sure they'll come up. So we're going to start with Lindsay. This is Lindsay Koshgarian. She's Research Director at the National Priorities Project. Her research interests include education and workforce spending, social insurance and entitlement spending, debt and deficits. She has a master's degree in public policy from UCLA, and I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the National Priorities Project, and if you aren't, you should really look online and begin to use some of their wonderful research. So, Lindsay.
Thanks, Jean. So, there we go. There it is. It is only true. So this is showing about half a pie, which is actually more than what the Pentagon left us. So as many of you probably know, and I'll get into that. So this is not news to any of you, but it's news to me a little bit that people would be willing to say this. Of course it's about oil. And I'll show you another one from another figure. This is from an actual report issued by the Department of Defense a couple years ago during the Obama administration. Climate change is an urgent and growing threat to our national security. Duh. Natural disasters, refugee flows, conflicts over basic resources, and we're already seeing this, and we've seen it so drastically here in the US over the last few weeks with hurricane after hurricane. And I hear that now there's a dam in Puerto Rico that is about to give way, and they're evacuating people. As a result of the damage from the hurricanes. So it's here, it's already happening. And the more it goes on, the more there's going to be a temptation by the United States to respond with increased militarism and increased military force around the world. Not to mention that while we're tempted to increase our reliance on the military to solve problems like refugee crises and conflicts, the Pentagon is one of the biggest consumers of fossil fuels in the world. In 2015, the Pentagon spent $7 billion on petroleum-based propellants and fuels. And I drive a Toyota Corolla, and that would be enough for me to fill up for the next 4.3 million years. So we're in a really broken cycle here. We're relying on fossil fuels. Our military relies on fossil fuels. That creates climate change. Climate change creates more conflict, and on and on. How do we get out of it? One, we have to get the word out that climate change is a national security threat. Sure. And some people already know this. Some people are already out there and have been out there speaking about it. The more we have, the more the effects of climate change are felt, the more we'll have international conflict and the more temptation there will be to address it through militarism. And it's going to contribute to terrorism. Look, even a friend of George W. Bush says so. Oops, I think I skipped one. We have to start here. We have the resources to solve climate change. They're just in the wrong places. This is our discretionary federal spending. It's a little over $1 trillion. And the biggest, by far, chunk of it is for military spending. That blue chunk, more than half of the pie at 56% now in fiscal year 2017, and possibly about to rise, $659 billion. And if you add to that federal spending on militarization here at home, on incarceration and policing and deportations and raids and border security, you easily get up to about 65%. So that leaves only 1 in 3 discretionary dollars for everything else, including changing our energy sources. That's the part of the budget that has renewable energy programs. That's the part of the budget that has research into new technologies and renewable energies. That's where that money can come from, and there's only 1 in 3 discretionary dollars available, and that has to compete with education and with veterans benefits and with housing programs and with so many other things. Just 1 in 3 federal dollars are available for. So we need to move the money. Meanwhile, the amount we're taking away from our own security and our own safety and health and well-being as a people is much more than any other country is taking away from their own well-being and their own safety and health and welfare as a people. The United States is the biggest military spender in the world by far. In any given year, we're spending about from 30 to 40% of the world's total on our military. And you may notice that a couple of the top threats that people talk about, North Korea and Iran, don't even rate on this. They're not here. We spend 28 times more on our military than we do fighting climate change. But climate change is a serious threat to national security, and it's time to act like it. There are plenty of things we can cut. There we go. Here's one. Over the lifetime of the F-35 jet fighter, it's projected to cost $1 trillion. And it is not contributing anything to our national security. Likewise, over the next 30 years, the US wants to spend $1 trillion upgrading our nuclear arsenal, starting a new nuclear arms race. That money, if we reinvested it in utility-grade solar power, could power every household in the United States 4 times over. We have the resources. They're right there. We just have to move them. And one key to unlock that is about jobs. There is a huge reliance by the military and military contractors on their economic benefits in communities. They take that to Congress, they take it to local communities, they take it to local leaders, and then they cash it in. And that's what we have to do with climate change. This is a screenshot from the official website for the F-35 jet fighter. And you can go here and you can find your own state, and it'll tell you, oh, whoops. It'll tell you how many locations there are, how many direct and indirect jobs there are, which for any of you who are at all familiar with economic impact analysis, it means they're taking credit not just for the jobs where they actually employ people, but for the jobs that are created when those employees go to the mall in their local community. So they're just claiming credit for everything. And then they tell you the total economic impact. And they have this for every state. They are claiming an economic impact almost everywhere. And again, they take that to the members of Congress, they take that to local communities, and they cash it in. This was an article from a couple years ago from my local paper, the Springfield Republican, in Springfield, Massachusetts. And it was co-written by a military industry representative and a local economic development official. And they boasted about the growth in revenues that local military contractors were experiencing. In some cases, they boasted about the growing jobs, but in some cases, growing revenues doesn't translate to growing jobs, and they went ahead and boasted about it anyway. And this is something where, as we know, in our government, representatives of both parties fall for this. This is not a problem of the right versus the left in Congress, except for a few folks. There are many people who, of any party and in between, who are happy to defend this spending based on the facts that it creates jobs in their local community. But it doesn't do a very good job of creating jobs. The $230 billion that we spend on war, a $230 billion investment in war creates 1.6 million jobs when it's invested in war. That's a lot of jobs. It's a lot. But if we invested it in clean energy, we'd create 500,000 more jobs. That's powerful. That's something that we can start to translate it into realities in specific places, will gain power as people see it start to work. So how do we get there? So one way is by stopping new and expanded wars, because we know that when we're at war, the general public is not particularly amenable to cutting military spending. So we have to be in a place of relatively less conflict that the US is engaged in. So that's why it's actually important for climate change that we stop any potential conflict with North Korea. It's important for climate change that we stop any potential conflict with Iran. It's important and protect the Iran nuclear deal. It's important for climate change that we don't allow this escalation in Afghanistan to continue. Because when the United States citizens feel and residents feel threatened, they are much less likely to support moving money away from the Pentagon. We can make clear that climate change really is a national security threat. And as much as we may be able to do that, and we can make that argument, and we should, and we need to, unfortunately, we're being helped by hurricanes and other events that are making it clear for us. We can support alternate budgets, like the People's Budget. The People's Budget is the budget from the Congressional Progressive Caucus. The last time it came to a vote, it got 96 votes in the House. It needs more. And I'll talk a little bit in a minute about what the People's Budget does that would help to address this. We can preserve funding for the Office of Economic Adjustment. That's the office within the Pentagon that provides support for communities transitioning away from reliance on military contracts to other things, to diversifying their local economies so that it doesn't feel like such a hit when military spending gets cut. And we can convert existing facilities and workforces in pilot communities from military work to clean energy work. And this is an idea that's been explored in a few communities, and it hasn't come to fruition much yet, but it's something that needs to continue. We need to continue to push, and we need successful pilot cases for that. So this is what the People's Budget would do about it. And not even all the members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus have voted for it. So even if you're in a district that's represented by a progressive, and certainly if you're in a district that's represented by a Democrat, you can ask your member to support this budget and vote for it. And make sure that they know what's in it, and make sure that they know why it's important. So why it's important for this, it does many, many things that would help, that would be a great improvement from where we are now, but it increases resources for the Office of Economic Adjustment so that there would be more support for programs to shift money in local communities away from the military industry to other industries. It ends war spending under the Overseas Contingency Operations account immediately, which has been the major slush fund ranging from $50 billion to anywhere upwards of $100 billion a year for the Pentagon. It ends that right away. It cuts military spending over time, and it audits the Pentagon. In over 20 years since the federal government, since Congress originally passed a law saying that every major federal agency needed to be audited, the Pentagon has never once submitted a full audit, let alone passed it. So it requires that to finally happen. And it would invest about $50 million a year in green jobs and transforming our energy infrastructure, which according to a study from the University of Massachusetts would be approximately the amount of public investment that would be needed to meet the IPCC international target for reducing emissions by 40% by 2035. Yeah, sorry, that should be a B, 50 billion. Which in federal spending terms is not a huge amount, right? It's less than 10% of what of military spending. We can get the word out in local communities about why the reliance on military jobs may not be a good thing. This is a series that recently ran in the Providence Journal in Rhode Island about their local employer Electric Boat and how it's been a roller coaster in terms of jobs for that community because there's an over-reliance on that one employer, and about whether the ships that the Electric Boat builds are even necessary for our national security, and about whether there is a better way for job creation. So if you can contribute to having coverage like this in your own local community, raise the question, make it no longer unspeakable. There are places where it's unspeakable to talk about shutting down the local military contractor. It can't be unspeakable anymore. And you can use the tool that National Priorities Project has on our website, and you can find out how many jobs could be created in your community with various different cuts to the military. So what it shows up here is an example where you can choose on the left what military spending program you want to cut. So this example is cutting Predator and Reaper drones, and what you could have for that instead, including clean energy jobs. And so that's another thing you can do. You can have that fact at your disposal for your own state, your own city, your own congressional district, depending on whether you're going to a lobby visit or writing an op-ed. And you can say, here's how many jobs we could have instead. We're not doing this right. We're not supporting our communities right. And so that's my final point. And I would just kind of go back to this. We need to protect our programs that are actually helping to shift money away from military contractors and diversify employment in local communities through the Office of Economic Adjustment. We need to support alternatives like the People's Budget, which right now is the best alternative out there in Congress, for cutting military spending and for investing in climate change. And we need to get the word out that climate change is a national security threat. this is something that we need to address. And if we can get that word out, and if we can contribute to a couple of pilot cases in local communities where there are some examples of companies that have looked into doing this, including Oregon Iron in Oregon, which is a military contractor, but has looked into expanding its work into renewable technologies. And that's something where if in a few local communities we can target companies and convince them that the future does not lie with them and they need to shift their work, that would have immense power to be able to show a successful case of that.
Thank you very much, Lindsay. And now I get to introduce a personal hero of mine, Bruce Gagnon, who is the coordinator of the Global Network Against Weapons and Nuclear Power in Space. For 15 years, he was the state coordinator of the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, and he's worked on space issues for 30 years. He's traveled very widely and spoken in England, Germany, Mexico, Canada, France, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Japan, Australia, Scotland, Wales, and on and on. So we're very fortunate to have him speak at our conference. Bruce.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. It's great to be with you today. I feel like we're all family here. It's nice. I want to just say out the door, straight out the door is a Veterans for Peace table, and on that table is the Global Network newsletter and our poster for our annual Keep Space for Peace Week, which comes up in October. Everything the U.S. military does today is coordinated and directed by space technology. So no matter whether it's a ship in the ocean, troops on the ground, airplanes, missiles flying, everything is coordinated by U.S. satellites and ground stations all over the planet. And in all these places around the world where these downlink stations are built by the U.S., there are peace groups in those communities saying, we don't want a component of the U.S. Star Wars program in our community, and that is essentially the membership of the global network. So I invite you to take our newsletter and check it out. Let me start with this question. I think I'm going to guess that you are all going to know the answer to it. What's the U.S.'s #1 industrial export product today? That's right. And when weapons are your #1 industrial export product, what is your global marketing strategy for that product line? Years ago, during the Bush II administration, I was watching C-SPAN one evening, and it's a huge auditorium here in Washington, a lot of people, military brass uniforms, and they said a lot of CIA people were in the audience, hundreds of them. And the speaker was Thomas Barnett, who was the author of a new book called The Pentagon's New Map. And he was introduced as Donald Rumsfeld's strategy guy. Well, I ran and got a notepad and listened to his 3-hour presentation. If you go online on YouTube and Google Thomas Barnett, Pentagon's New Map, it's very instructive what he had to say. Basically, he said that under corporate globalization of the world economy, every different country is going to have a different role, a different job. And he said, our job in the United States will be security export. Okay, and that's what we are today, which translates to me, endless war. And so the only way we're going to get out from behind this 8-ball is conversion of the military-industrial complex. And so let me talk about that. In the late 1980s to early 1990s, while working at that time for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, we organized around the economic conversion issue and put together a statewide conference calling for the conversion of the military-industrial complex in our state to peaceful and sustainable technologies. Our keynote speaker at the conference was the president of the International Association of Machinists, the union that represents many weapons production workers. The Soviet Union had just collapsed, and the nation was talking about the peace dividend. How should we spend all that money that was then being wasted on the war machine? And so a conversion movement was growing by leaps and bounds across the country at the time. And a national conference was held, led by the father of economic conversion, Columbia professor Seymour Melman. The conference was held in Boston. Labor and peace movement had a common agenda: replace the jobs at military production facilities with useful green jobs. Studies, as she mentioned, at UMass Amherst Economics Department have long shown that military spending creates far fewer jobs than any other kind of federal investment. So if we want jobs that create sustainable production, then conversion is the answer. You can find a link to this study at the Global Network website on our homepage, spaceforpeace.org. This conversion movement was a potential threat, and President George Herbert Walker Bush, Daddy Bush, invaded Panama in December of 1989 and Iraq in 1991. This began the process of ensuring that the United States found new enemies, and the conversion movement began to fall on hard times. Most peace groups made a tragic mistake of giving up on the issue because it wasn't popular anymore, and folks moved on to more immediate fires to put out. But activists should have kept on message, still opposing these new wars, but also integrating the conversion message into the what can we do part of their toolbox. We can't just keep saying no. We need a yes, a positive, transformative vision to share with the public as well. In one of Seymour Melman's last articles in 2003, he noted that New York City put out a proposal to spend up to $6 billion to replace subway cars. Melman calculated that if this work was done in the United States, about 32,000 jobs would have been created. But not a single U.S. company bid on the job, in large part because the nation no longer had the ability to build rail cars. The complexity of the military production system focuses industry on specialized machinery and tools that have little to no utility in the non-military world. After moving to Maine in 2003, my partner, Mary Beth Sullivan, and I began to bring the conversion message to ongoing protests at Bath Iron Works, BIW, where I live today, where only destroyers are built for the Navy. These destroyers are outfitted with so-called missile defense systems used to encircle Russia and China today. Early on, we met a BIW worker by the name of Peter Woodruff, who asked for help drafting a petition saying that workers at the shipyard wanted to build wind turbines and not just destroyers. Peter started going out early in the morning as people came to work, got a few others to help him, and gathered 800 signatures out of about 5,000 workers. And remember that Bath Iron Works has about 4 different installations between 2 towns, so it's not easy to get to everybody all at one time. After that, Peter agreed to meet with the local newspaper editor, who wrote an editorial congratulating him on his courage. The editor called for the diversification of Bath Iron Works. Peter made bumper stickers that said, "We want to build wind turbines," and handed them out to fellow workers. They put the stickers on their trucks and on their lunch pails. Peter also, working in the tool room, put on the bulletin board right in front of the tool room where everybody had to line up every morning to check out their tools. And he would put copies of flyers of protests coming up that we were organizing in the community. He would put copies of my blog posts. Some people started to say to him after a while, "Are you related to this Bruce Gagnon guy? You keep putting his blog things on there all the time." But he really created a discussion inside Bath Iron Works. He also found on C-SPAN archives coverage of a 1994 Labor Day rally at Bath Iron Works that called for the conversion of the shipyard. Speakers that day included President Bill Clinton. You might have heard of him. He says he never ever inhaled, by the way. The president of BIW was there. Several top national and local labor leaders, including the Secretary Treasurer of the AFL-CIO, then Senator George Mitchell from Maine, and our local congressman. Over and over again, these voices used that much forgotten word by 1994, conversion. They were worried about this peace dividend, even though it was beginning to fade at that time. They were worried about it and calling for conversion of the shipyard to civilian production. So we've been spreading this video widely in our community and in order to show people that at one time in Bath, this was mainstream thinking, conversion. Peter and I also had a radio show at Bowdoin College in nearby Brunswick for 6 years, a 2-hour show every week where we talked politics, played political music, and always talked about the conversion of the shipyard. But we had to cancel the show because after 34 years of working at Bath Iron Works and inhaling steel dust that you breathe in as they cut steel, Peter has lost the ability to speak. He can write, he can communicate on email, but he just can't talk anymore. A real tragedy. And he's just one of many in the community. He went to the company doctor to get diagnosed, to try to hold the company responsible. And the company's doctor response was, "Are you trying to hurt the company?" And the doctor actually fired Peter as a patient, something I've never ever heard of in my life. BIW could build wind turbines, commuter rail cars, solar panels, and tidal-powered systems, creating more jobs and building something that actually would be needed. A couple of years ago, General Dynamics, that owns Bath Iron Works, requested $6 million in tax breaks from the already strapped city of Bath. General Dynamics had previously received $197 million in tax breaks from the city and state, always threatening to leave if they didn't get them. No one ever said no to General Dynamics and Bath Iron Works. We put together a small, very small, local committee of Bath residents to oppose these tax breaks. We put flyers on every house and business in the city, a population of 10,000 people. We flyered the doors across the community. We organized a public event. We attended city council meetings. And statewide media began to cover the story because no one had ever dared oppose a tax break for the shipyard before. In the end, we found out that many people in our BIW dependent community opposed the tax cuts, and the city council very, very reluctantly cut the request in half. So city taxpayers saved $3 million, which is half of our annual city budget. With mounting local property taxes, largely due to federal and state cutbacks and human needs and infrastructure programs, because of endless war, everything gets dumped now on local communities. If you want any services, you have to raise your taxes to pay for them. The public was quite ready to stand up against more corporate welfare, and that's just the way we cut the issue in our community. More corporate welfare. even for the top industrial employer in Maine. Our campaign continues today.